Hey, I'm Fred, alcoholic. I am one of the, I actually have some stuff written, which I don't know if I'm going to stay to it or not, but thanks, Jeff, for uh, being my friend and for taking me through the steps. The guys that he was talking about that I was listening to was these guys, Joe Hawk and Mark Houston and Don Prince, some of these old guys in AA, and he actually knew them. And I'd been listening to a bunch of stuff from them, and I loved the message that they had. And so when he said that he actually knew them, it was pretty cool. And walking through the steps with him was pretty life changing. Uh, and Dora, you did great. I should be the suspect. Uh, Yeah, I've been doing thinking this last week. You know, it's interesting. I'm standing here. My dad's a pastor. I'll get to that in a second, but it just sort of feels like like I'm preaching, and that's sort of weird. I don't know how to. This is just interesting. So, but I've been thinking about the word alcoholic. You know, when I came in 3 years ago, a little over 3 years ago, something inside me. I knew I was an alcoholic, but if you got me and sat me down and said, "Fred, what's an alcoholic?" I I don't think I would have had a good answer for you. And it took me going through the steps, listening to these things, and through this process, I learned. You know, it's interesting. The big book, the first, the doctor's opinion up to page 44 is all step one. That's what it is. And the first 23 pages are about this phenomena of craving, including the doctor's opinion. And I learned and I saw my experience in what was written in that book is that whenever I took a drink, I could not control the amount of alcohol that I had, that I took, that it wasn't just one drink led to another one. And then from page 23 to page 44, it makes a little switch and it says the problem's in our mind. The main problem is in our mind, and we have this obsession of in our mind that once we stop, if we do stop, and I had a lot of starts and stops. Once we stopped, we couldn't stay stopped. And um, when it's done with that, and right when it goes into we agnostics, it has what I believe is the best definition of alcohol in one sentence. And it's on page 44, and it says, if when we honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely, that's the mental obsession, or if when drinking you have little control over the amount that you take, the physical allergy, you're probably an alcoholic. And I realized that's what I was. But then the very next sentence, right after it says that, you're probably an alcoholic, it says this. But if that be the case, you may be suffering from an illness which only a spiritual experience will conquer. And I remember the first time I'm reading that going, man, you're talking about the physical, you're talking about the mental. What in the world? Why do I need a spiritual experience to get over this? And you flip the page, just to page 45, and it says that, what my problem is, I've got this lack of power. I have no power to get over this, right? And that was my dilemma. And that's exactly what this book is about. Its main object is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself, and here's the kicker, right? Which will solve your problem. And the thing is, that's on page 45, and it takes another 18, 17 pages before it finally tells me what my problem was. And that I remember sitting in a room when I heard it from this book. Here's my problem: selfishness, self-centeredness. That we think is the root of your troubles. And I went, oh my gosh, this is it. This could be the solution, because drinking and drugging and all this other stuff isn't my problem. I'm my problem. I'm like, this could be it. And then you flip over to page 64 and it says this, it says, being convinced that selfishness, manifested in various ways, was what had defeated us. We considered its common manifestations, and resentment is the number one offender. It destroys more alcoholics than anything else, for from it stems all forms of spiritual disease. Spiritual disease. For we have been not only mentally and physically ill, we have been spiritually sick. And when the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically. That's one of, to me, the greatest promises in the big book. And it's also why, for me, it's important that when I tell my story, it's not just about the drinking and drugging, but it's about the spiritual malady that I had. You know, it says on page 29, on what we read on in every meeting, how it works, where it says, what it's been like, or what it was like, what happened, and what we're like now. There's another thing on page 29 that I like, where it says each individual in his personal stories describes in his own language and from his own point of view the way in which he established his relationship with God. And God is just another way for us to talk about the spiritual, the force that's out there. And so for me, it's important that I bring in the fact that this has been a spiritual journey for me, because here's what I found in my experience long before I ever took a drink. When I was 14 or 13 years old, I had this spiritual malady. I was sick. I was born and raised in Africa. My dad was a missionary, and my mother passed when I was born, and my dad sort of had a mental breakdown. And what's interesting is I've been going through the steps and getting over some of the resentments. My history is changing. Now it didn't change, but my perspective of it has changed. And instead of this part of my story being, oh, poor me, my mom died when I was born. What was that like for my dad? Who had sold and given away everything in his life to serve this God that he loved. And he's on the mission field, and his wife dies. And he has this mental breakdown, and he ends up getting remarried. And we finally moved back to the States when I was 5 years old. And I felt different. And, I learned, by being in a preacher's home, I learned, and going to church and all this stuff my whole life, I learned very quickly, Fred, you're a sinner. And I wanted so desperately, I used to think that it was just that I wanted to fit in, but really what it was is I wanted your guys' approval, because I couldn't stand myself. I didn't like who I was. I couldn't be good enough. And I thought that if maybe I could do and put on the mask and be just the right person, you would like me, and I could live off of that. And so by the time I'm 14 years old, this malady is in me, and I can't do anything about it. I can't be good enough. I'm wearing masks, I'm lying, I'm stealing, I'm doing all these things, and I have my first drink. And I didn't have another drink till high school. But it didn't do for me what a lot of people, for me, it was just sort of trying to fit in, trying to gain approval of my friends. And it wasn't readily available since I didn't see it in my home. So I didn't have another drink again till I was 14. But that first time I drank alcoholically, I stole a bottle of MD 2020 from a little tiny grocery store. And the person I was with took 2 sips, and I drank the rest of the bottle. And that wasn't a pleasant feeling. I mean, I'm ripped at 14, had no idea what's going on, just went home and passed out, praying to God my parents didn't find out, because they were sure to send me to hell then. I mean, I was going to go really quick. Dad didn't find out, and I wake up, and we moved to Texas, or we moved from Texas to Minnesota, and now I'm in high school, and it's the party thing. And it's just sort of here or there. I'm not really uh, drinking a lot. It's just on weekends. But when I get out of high school, by the time I'm 21, by the time I'm 20, 21, it became an everyday thing. I was working at a restaurant, and in that industry, drinking and drugging was just a part of it. And I was on fire. I mean, I went to bed at night at about midnight and I popped 5 Whitecaps, which is speed, so that I could wake up real early in the morning to get onto work, and then I'd go to work, work a full day, go home, or go to my friend's house, trip on acid, smoke weed, drink, and do it all over again, pop more Whitecaps so I could wake up. And that became my life. But then I had one of my first spiritual experiences. And that experience got me to come here to Seattle. And so I come to Seattle, and during that spiritual experience, um, what I realized in my life is this spiritual cycle started, where when I'm drinking and drugging, I was super low, super sad, and then I'd have a spiritual experience, and I'd get on this high, and I'd start going to church, and I'd start doing the right things. And so during this time, my first couple years in Seattle, I'm on this spiritual high, and I meet a gal, we get married, and poor gal had no idea what she was in for, because down just a couple years after we're married, I'm have just one drink, and the next thing you know, we can't just have one because of the physical allergy, and so that drink becomes another and another and another. And in 1998, I got a DUI, and we were separated at the time, and it was there that I was forced to go to treatment and to go to AA. And I'd never heard of AA. I didn't even know what that was. I remember coming to these rooms and I really enjoyed it. I remember thinking, man, why can't the church be more like this? Why can't there be more of this in the church? I really thought that there was something here. I remember back then thinking, keep coming back. It works if you work it. I did a lot of thinking about that back then. What is it? Keep coming back. It works if you work it. And um, after a couple years of in and out and not really getting sober, I had 7 years of sobriety, and I was doing AA. I didn't finish the steps. I got through step 5 and stopped, and had 7 years of sobriety, and things were fairly good. But then I went down to Katrina I'm a roofer. I said that right. She's from Canada, and I say roofer. But anyway, I went down to help out at Katrina in Lake Charles, and that was the year that the Seahawks were doing their run for the Super Bowl with the Steelers. And the only place to watch, because we were staying in a little trailer, the only place to watch the games was at a bar. And the next thing you knew, I had a drink in my hand. And that started 15 years of me destroying my life. I ended up down the road closing my business. I had a fairly successful business that I just closed. Didn't sell, didn't do anything. I just closed, filed for bankruptcy. And then my wife and I separated. And again, I'd had these ups and downs. And when we first separated, I had a year again of this spiritual high. I was going back to church. Things are good. Everything's great. And I met a gal at that time, and I went to a wedding with her, and I ordered a drink. And it was the first time in my life that the reins were off. I didn't have that wife pointing her finger at me. And all of a sudden, wow, I'm free. And I began drinking and drugging, and slept around a couple people, met someone who we had a long-term relationship with. And I remember feeling at that point in my life when I was still drinking, like Bill said in his story, when early on in his story, he felt like he had arrived. For me, that was it. I'd arrived. I'm free. I can just, this is who I am. I remember pointing my finger to God, you made me like this. And so I'm just going to do this. And if you want to do something about it, you do something about it. And I just sort of kept destroying my life. But in January 1st of 2022, God separated me from alcohol. The gal I was with at the time, it was just dry January. We were just going to do dry January. God separated through a course of events. She ended up going down to Arizona to be with a guy who was in a motorcycle accident. And I stayed, because she was a nurse. And so I stayed sober for 45 days. And again, I'm on this spiritual high. And get down there, and the guy gets out of the hospital, and the first thing that he wants to do when he gets out of the hospital is go to an AA meeting, because he's got 20 years sober. And the gal I was with didn't want to go. And so I took him, and I remember feeling so hopeless. And I walk into that room, and the hope, and I felt that hope. And at that time, I come back home and I decide I'm going to do this. I'm going to stay sober. And I began going to a lot of meetings. I began reading the big book, and I began listening. I had tons of time in my truck, and I began listening to a lot of workshops. The guys that I mentioned, Mark Houston and Joe Hawk and Don Prince and some of the other guys that had a spiritual solution to this problem. I began listening to a lot of it. And what's interesting is 6 months later, so here I am, 7 months sober, and I find myself restless, irritable, and discontented. And I remember reading that in the book somewhere, right? And I'm like, what is it that the book says about this? You know? And so I go to the book and I find it in the doctor's opinion. And it says, men and women drink essentially because they like the effect produced by alcohol. The sensation is so elusive that while they admit it is injurious, they cannot, after a time, differentiate the true from the false. To them, their alcoholic life seems like the only one. They are restless, irritable, and discontented unless they can again experience the sense of ease and comfort what comes at once by taking a few drinks which they see others take with impunity. And after they have succumbed to the desire again, as so many of them do, the phenomenon of craving develops, and they pass through the well-known stages of a spree, emerging remorseful with a firm resolution not to drink again. And this is repeated over and over and over again. And unless this person can experience an entire psychic change, there is very little hope of his recovery. And I sat there that day and I looked at my life and I went, this shit ain't working. I'm not getting any relief. I'm going to tons of meetings. You know, what's interesting is I looked at the correlation between church and AA, my solution in church and my solution in AA. I went to church. I went to meetings. I read the Bible. I read the big book. I went to Bible studies. I was listening to workshops and going to book studies. I went to counseling. I got a sponsor. And yet I wasn't getting any better. And a spiritual mentor of mine had said to me, and it came to my mind, it says, you can weigh a mindset or a belief by its fruit. So in other words, if what you're thinking, what you're feeling, or your attitude, if it's not producing something good in you, then it has to be discarded. And I was like, oh my gosh, everything that I've believed about God, I've got to put it aside. And Don Prince came up with the set-aside prayer, and I began praying that. And the set-aside prayer is this: God, please set aside, put on a shelf, everything that I think I know about myself, others, and especially everything that I think I know about you. so I can have an open mind for a new experience with you. And I began praying that every day, and I got a sponsor, and I worked the steps. And AA, through that process, AA gave me the greatest gift I've ever had, which is a spiritual awakening. All the experiences, all the ups that I'd had during my life, all these spiritual experiences that I had. And if you'd asked me back then, I would have told you I had a relationship with God. I would have told you that I was awake. But just like when you're asleep, you don't really know you're sleeping. It wasn't until I woke up, where I woke up spiritually, that I realized my life, I'd been daydreaming my whole life, thinking I was awake. And the difference I see in my life between my spiritual experience in the church and the spiritual experience I've had in AA is, in the church, I kept doing steps 1, 2, and 3, and sometimes step 7 over and over again. I got to this point where I throw my hands up. I can't do this anymore. God, please take my life. Here's my life, and I give it to him. And I'd be living for a while, but then that sense of restlessness, irritable, and discontent would come back. And I didn't realize that that monster inside of me was just waiting. It was going to take me. And it took me. What's the difference between the church and AA? Is AA has a very clear-cut set of directions. And unfortunately, in my experience, the church didn't. It didn't have a clear-cut set of directions that led me to a spiritual experience, an awakening of my own understanding with God that got me to the point where I could be free. And I use this analogy, I'll say it real quickly. Steps 1, 2, and 3, I like to think of the steps in the form of an electric guitar. Steps 1, 2, and 3, an electric guitar has to get plugged in. And that's all that steps 1, 2, and 3 are. You take the guitar and you plug it in. And it's got all the power necessary to run that guitar. But the guitar doesn't work. Why? You start playing and it doesn't work right. Well, because the amp isn't on, and you have to flip the power switch on the amp. In steps 4, 5, 6, and 7, it says very clearly in the big book that the reason for these steps is to remove anything from us that blocks us from God and from others. And that's all a power switch is. It's just something that stops the power from getting to the guitar. And so I had to flip that switch. I went through steps 4, 5, 6, and 7. But then you pick up the guitar and you start playing it. And 30 years of drinking and drugging, my life was out of tune. I was out of tune with people. I wasn't playing good at all, anything. And I had to get in tune with people. So it gets, my guitar got tuned up. And then through steps 10 and 11, on a daily time, I'm fine tuning that guitar. I'm getting my life okay with you, and I'm getting my life okay with God. And then step 12, there's a line in the book that is really has become my favorite line in the book, which is, our real purpose is to fit ourselves to be of maximum service to God and to others. And anytime I hear it talked about in AA, that sentence, what people talk about is being of maximum service. The problem that I see with that is that's not my purpose. My purpose is to fit myself to be of maximum service. That's what the sentence says. My real purpose is to be ready, because I'm not the guitarist. I'm not the guitarist. I'm just a guitar. And when God wants, he'll pick up that guitar and he'll play it. And because I'm fit, I'll be of maximum service. So thanks for letting me guys share my story. I appreciate it.